So I'll just welcome everyone to the first Quello Speaker Series of 2024. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, my friend and colleague, Vikki Katz. Vikki Katz is a professor in the School of Communication at Chapman University, and she examines how children and parents learn about and with technology in lower income, working class, and immigrant families in the US. Her research on digital inequality has informed federal, state, and district level policymakers to ensure that all families have the digital tools they need to thrive, both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. And prior to her appointment at Chapman, she was a faculty member at Rutgers University in the School of Communication Information, where we met and worked together for a number of wonderful years. She was also a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation and a senior research fellow at the Joanne Gans Cooney Center SSME Workshop. And Vikki serves as an advisor to pbskids.com and CPB, PBS's Ready to Learn program, which supports the development of PBS programming to promote early learning and school readiness. And she's, of course, also the editor of the Journal of Children and Media. And so I'll welcome Vikki to the Quello Center Speaking Series, where we record these talks for future posterity, but we do stop recording just before the question period begins so that everyone can feel free to ask questions freely. So I'll turn it over to Vikki. Thank you, Vikki, for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everybody, for giving me a chance to talk about a project that it's been near and dear to my heart and something I've been working on for the last number of years now. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a project that's focused on working class parents and the places that they see opportunity in the future of work as we head into an ever more technologizing future. You can see the two pictures I picked here are very much indicative of a change in how people understand technologies for work, especially in places like Pittsburgh, where I've been conducting this work. So just to give you a little bit of background, and this is related to some of the work and thinking that Keith and I've done together for many years, and I've been very influenced by the way he's thought about these things. But that very often when we think about responses to technological change, technology adoption, technology engagement, it's treated as an individual level variable. And especially when we start talking about things like the future of learning, the future of work. When we think about work, we think of adults. When we think of learning, we think of young people or children. And my response to that is to think of this in a more family-centered way rather than individual, because very little of how we understand both learning across the lifespan, but also preparation for work in a changing world is truly individual. We lean on the people we are closest to, and I'm interested in this cross-generational experience of both how current adults sort of see themselves in the changes that are happening in the working world, but also how they see schools' efforts to prepare their children for, as the U.S. Department of Education has famously said, for 21st century jobs that don't exist yet. If you have trouble wrapping your head around that idea, so does everybody else. The other thing that looking at technology often removes, because we emphasize digital technologies, capabilities for anytime, anywhere communication, is the importance of place. Because most of how we use technology, how we understand it, how we understand opportunities are actually very localized. And so these are two things that sort of underwrite how I do my work in general, but also very much how I'm thinking about the project I'm going to talk to you about today. And I see technology in looking at working class families and how they're understanding these things as what Arlie Hochschild, the brilliant sociologist, would refer to as a keyhole issue. She's a terrific qualitative sociologist that many of you may know. She talks about keyhole issues that are not technology. She looks at things like environmental regulation and how people respond to it. But the metaphor she uses for the keyhole issue is this idea that when you interview somebody about a topic, you're looking through the keyhole through a door into one room, right? And people tell you things about their lives, but it gives you glimpses into other rooms, into other things that are happening in people's lives that they may not have spoken to you about directly, either because of motivations to keep certain things private or because they're just harder to articulate. But I see the technological timelines and how families sort of place themselves in these timelines of understanding technological change, how it's affected their families and their people in the past, how it's affecting them today, and how it affects them in the future as a keyhole issue. Because so much of technological change is about managing uncertainty. And for folks in blue collar, you know, families raising children in the what is often referred to as the Rust Belt, or formerly as the Rust Belt, but the industrial areas of the country, talking to them about technological change and how it affects work actually brings up a lot about control and dignity and stability and how much sort of protection you can offer your children based on your own experience, things that are harder for parents to talk about. But in the context of thinking about technology and changes to work and school, end up coming up quite a bit. So those are just sort of some of the things that I come to this work with. And, you know, the project that I'm going to talk to you about looks at Pittsburgh, which many of you may be very familiar with. Why focus on working class families in Pittsburgh and how they're thinking about a technologizing future? For a few reasons. Many of them being related to Pittsburgh being something of a positive deviance example. That when we look at parts of what's been colloquially referred to as the Rust Belt, Pittsburgh's been unusually successful in rebranding itself, both with homegrown technology companies that have come out of the local universities, but also in attracting, you know, major corporations, Google to headquarters there, but also in just sort of shifting their economy from one that was heavily manufacturing and industrially centered to what they were as eds and meds, right? It's a major healthcare innovation hub. It's a major education hub across the lifespan. There's been a lot of really thoughtful citywide emphasis and investment on learning across the lifespan, on ensuring that people don't get left behind, these kinds of changes, but also in reimagining different forms of learning that make sense locally. And all of that suggests a few things, but one of the reasons it makes it an interesting case study place is that it's always, I think, most interesting to understand how people make decisions when they have real choices. If you're looking at a place where there's very little opportunity to reskill or learn a new trade or options for young people after they leave high school, and then really you're looking at a story that's very easy to see. People are either going to take the option available or they're going to not take it and end up, you know, sort of a bit lost. But if they have truly excellent options and can articulate why they're choosing between them, you end up with much more interesting variation in the results. And so, for example, one of the things that is indicative of Pittsburgh and is, you know, true of some parts of the, you know, formerly industrial parts of the US, but that is really, really strong in Pittsburgh and in the community where I did this work, is that they had centers that trained high school, mainly boys, to be ready to go to work in the steel mills and factories right after graduation. The one that the kids in the community where I studied go to is actually called the Steel Center. But rather than shut those down when the factories and the mills closed, they reimagined what vocational training and skilled trades looked like. And as a result, these high schoolers and the middle schoolers that I spoke to were getting ready to make choices. They have real choices for what they could do in high school and beyond. There are kids who go into fully college tracks, and there are kids who take these vocational tech tracks where they spend half their day for 3 years of high school learning a trade. And if they learn a trade, for example, like welding, they graduate high school union eligible and with a floor earning capacity of $35 an hour. The Steel Center's also rethought trades more broadly. You can take classes in design and come out with certifications that you're ready to do the design kind of work that we usually think of as the province of college degrees. They're reimagining what technological integration into skilled trades work looks like. Everything from veterinary technicians to medical assistant training to cosmetology. And all of these young people graduate high school certified and ready to go to work without additional training. That is a real alternative to a 4-year degree. And that for me was one of the reasons that looking at places where college has not been the answer to every question would allow us to see how families are really understanding what the best options are for a technologizing future. So within Pittsburgh, there are 47 school districts, which for me was absolutely mind-blowing. And very few of them are meaningfully racially integrated. There's a longer history there that's beyond the bounds of this talk, but I'm happy to discuss it in Q&A. But there are a few reasons why I chose to focus on Homestead specifically. And Homestead its school district is the Steel Valley School District. Can't do better than that. And if that name sounds familiar to you, you might be a student of labor history, because while by the late 1800s, Pittsburgh was producing more than half of all the steel and iron in the US and twice as much as in all of England, Homestead was the leading producer within the US. It was the most profitable steel mill in Andrew Carnegie's considerable empire. But it's also a very seminal focus of the labor movement's history, because in an attempt to unionize there in 1892, the Homestead strike, the deadly clash between management and labor, was violently broken up by the Pinkerton men, by Henry Clay Frick. It set the unionization movement in the US back probably about 30 years. And so there's a very deep history of labor, of steel. It is all over the city, which is a 4 square mile community that has 2 elementary schools, a single middle school, and a single high school. It is a truly racially integrated school district. And one of the reasons that I wanted to focus on a racially integrated school district, not school districts that look like they're 50% or 50%, is that this reflects what Pittsburgh looks like demographically. But it means that kids are in shared classrooms. It's a small community. People are living in shared space. And so understanding the decisions that parents make and assessing the degree to which things like racial backgrounds make a difference, or whether there is truly a class-based sensibility here, was part of what I wanted to do. It's a place where the history informs the present in a lot of ways, and where that blue-collar collective identity is really foregrounded. I heard things from parents a lot, that things like, one parent who said, this is very much still a blue-collar town, even without the mill. Our school district's called Steel Valley. The heritage is there in the name. But in general, we keep it going. We named the bridge the Homestead Grays, which was the African-American baseball team of steel workers. We pull from the past all the time. And when I asked her, what does blue collar mean? What does it mean to be a blue collar town? She said, it's the 9 to 5, it's the working hard. There's no inheritances here, right? And that gives you a sense right from the outset of some of the sort of moral framings that parents bring to the questions of what best prepares their kids for a technologizing future. So the study that I did has sort of been a study in 2 parts, because kicking off with fieldwork in January of 2020, you can imagine where I'm going here. We started in January of 2020 because the goal was to interview within the span of the spring kids at the transition from elementary to middle school in 4th grade, from middle school to high school in 8th grade, and then 11th graders and their parents, to kind of understand the full sort of set of transitions of school and how kids and parents were thinking about the future of work. So we did interviews in January with 4th graders and their parents at both elementary schools, with school leaders, in February of 2020 with local leadership and citywide leadership on various learning programs. And then, of course, March of 2020, you may have some idea why we canceled the next phase of our trip for a while. But what I've done since the beginning of 2023 is to pick up this project in a second phase, because in many ways, the questions we were asking people about the future of learning and the future of work, the pandemic served as a natural experiment of what the sort of boundaries were or the limitations are about technology's use in education the absolute extent to which technology could be used in work. And so I started in January of 2023 by re-interviewing as many parents as I could get hold of to understand what the pandemic experience had done and whether or not it had changed their views on the things that we talked about. And, the short answer is not much. The kinds of existential crises that professional class parents were having during the pandemic, working class parents were having a whole lot less of. And then in March and May of this year, interviewed 8th and 11th graders in the 2 different tracks that I talked about, college bound and vocational tech programs, and their parents and school leaders. So far, there's been 140 in-depth interviews in the study, and it's a little more to do, but just about there. I want to give 2 minutes just to tell you how I've worked on analyzing this number of interviews. Those of you who do qualitative work are probably familiar with grounded theory because it's what we all say we're doing when we do qualitative coding. And then if you know that, then you're familiar with this idea that you start with the very smallest units of interest, and you kind of get broader as you go down from open coding to axial to selective. What I used instead was a strategy that's becoming really taking hold more in sociology, but that I hope will become more common in comm, because it flips grounded theory on its head. And instead of starting with the most specific observations, it starts with the broadest and narrows down. And the reason for that is twofold. The first is that grounded theory assumes an truly inductive approach. Interview studies almost never are. The questions that we ask in an interview study mean that we have priorities that are generally informed by prior work. And so there's no reason to use a totally inductive theory of analyzing if we're not using a totally inductive theory method to collect our data. Grounded theory was also intended for data sets of less than 10, and almost nobody does qualitative work with data sets of less than 10. As I said, this is 140 interviews. Starting with the most granular insights means that you're going to, by nature, privilege the first few interviews you do, and the rest are going to kind of follow suit. And so flexible coding flips this over. You start with large chunks, like sort of the sub-themes within your interviews, the sets of questions that you ask about a particular topic. You drill down from there into more specific analytic codes within them, and then you keep demographics out of the analysis until the very end, where you can check and see whether or not the codes kind of fell into significant breakdowns in terms of gender differences in your informants, racial and ethnic differences, age, or whatever demographics would be relevant to your study. It's also an analytic strategy better suited to team-based projects because it's much easier to determine which research questions are related to each code and sort of divide who will do which work. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the parent interviews, because obviously this is a project that's got many different parts, but I want to focus specifically on how parents viewed, what the best bets were for a technologizing future for their kids. And so just to give you an example of how that works, it means that I was working with index codes or sets of questions that related to parents' own experiences in school and after school, their perspectives on college or other post-secondary routes for it in general, right? So not their own experiences, but generally and for their own children, and questions that I asked them specifically about technology's role in the future of work. And you can see that some of the kind of the codes within those index codes are things like, for example, the messages that parents got when they were on the cusp of leaving high school about whether or not college was, for kids like them, or worries about college debt and so forth. The reasons that they're ambivalent about whether college is worth it, familiarity with trades as, part of understanding their perspectives on college more generally. And then, one of the themes that came up in the analytic coding most strongly in how they see technology's role in the future of work was about emphasizing forms of work where their kids would be able to control the pace of change that technology was going to be sort of bearing down on a particular industry. But this, I just want to give you a sense of how the work got done, because I think that's important. And so, like I said at the beginning, I think that families have technological timelines in that the past is informing the present and both inform the future. And I want to show you this just as an example, a representative example of how families see this. So this is a quote from a Black mother of a third grader who works as a carer, an elder carer. She's a high school graduate. And you can see that what she's emphasizing here, it's interesting when you ask people about, how they've seen technology changing work, everybody talks about the grocery store first, and the automated checkout in particular. And so this mom's, talking about, that there are people who lose a job because of that, but then there are also people who come up with the idea of how to make that machine. So maybe there aren't 8 cashiers, but it took the minds of maybe 10 people to come up with this machine and put it together, and they're constantly upgrading it. So, there's people on the front end that are out of a job, but on the back end, it's creating a lot of jobs, right? And you'll see that the perspective of a college-educated white father is actually very, very similar. That there's this idea that there are people with, that a lesser, sort of set of sort of higher education skills that might be losing out on jobs, service and retail workers, but that people on the back ends are, going to be creating all sorts of new ways of doing things. And so you can see that across older and younger kids, and this is reflective of the data, across older and younger kids, across racial and ethnic groups, across whether or not parents themselves have got college educations, they're seeing this sort of balanced view of like, well, it takes away certain jobs, but it adds other ones. What I think is very interesting is that you can see from this that unlike the conversations that usually happen where there's people who win the technologizing future and people who lose, right? This binary, where knowledge workers are winning, or perhaps we're winning until the advent of AI, and service and retail workers are losing, that these parents are really occupying a middle space that we often don't talk about in these conversations, which are skilled trades, where they're not identifying with the retail worker who's lost their job as a cashier. They're sort of seeing that loss, but it doesn't feel personal. They're not the ones losing those kinds of jobs. And they're seeing this opportunity for engineers and computer scientists to produce these new forms of logistics and programs. But the interesting thing is, and I'll talk about this, they're not seeing the computer science and engineering tracks and college as what their kids should be doing either. They are truly occupying this sort of middle space where they're seeing things from kind of neither one of the two sides that are usually set up as kind of how we should be thinking about how technology is changing and affecting the future of work. And so they think their children should be betting on the kinds of jobs where they can control the pace of change. This was a mom of a third grade boy, third grade, almost fourth grade, that said that, she'd just been discussing this with her kid the past week, like what jobs will look like in the future. And what she kind of laid out here was very much what came out across all the interviews, that, you should be looking at jobs that people are always going to need. Everything in the healthcare field, nursing, therapies and such, police work, firefighters, military. This was also a family that was former military and working in law enforcement. So that's part of, I think, why that came up. But then also plumbing and electrical work, things people are always going to need. That'll be steady paychecks. People are always going to need you. And that last line is very much emblematic of a blue collar approach to work, right? That it's about steady paychecks and what people are always going to need. It is very much hewing to a sense of stability and consistency more so than, following dreams and being inspired and work being where you find your meaning. But she nailed what people thought were the places people can control the pace of change, and frankly, where policymakers see the greatest growth, which is in healthcare and therapeutic settings, and sort of maintenance, construction, and sort of building projects. And so, let's focus on those one at a time and why these are seen by these families as the kinds of work where people can control the pace of change. The reasons that they see skilled healthcare work as places where technology is not going to come and take things over the way that technology obviated work in the mills and in industry, and didn't just obviate whole lines of work for their parents and grandparents, but whole ways of life, is because they don't think that these are the kinds of work that anyone is going to trust a robot to do. As one of the mothers who worked in nursing, and there were a lot of mothers in nursing, said, no one is ever going to trust a robot to take care of their children, their elderly, or their sick. And she's probably right, at least for her generation and the one to follow, if not further. And you can see here a mom saying, I don't see a robot ever taking over my job. You need that human sense of care. And that, you know, technologies can play a part in how you take care of somebody, but that there is a certain emphasis on human know-how and expertise that is simply not something in the forms of care work that are likely to be replaced, at least not in the foreseeable future. We see similar sorts of emphasis on skilled trades. You know, this is a mom of a 7th grader who had older children, one of whom, her son, was so close to being the first in their family to go to college that they actually had a dorm room assignment for him. And he just decided he got cold feet. He didn't want to do it. And she explained this in a way that showed, you know, sort of how disappointed she was that he hadn't taken this track. She was so excited about a kid who was going to get, you know, a college degree, but he just wasn't into it. And so he started working with his dad in construction, earning $100,000 plus a year at 20 years old, which, you know, it can make many of us, you know, reevaluate all our life choices. But that aside, she said, you know, I'm okay with that because the way the world's going right now, sorry, I just want to move you guys on my screen so that I can, so that I can read my own slides here. You know, that the way the world's going, we're going to need trades. You can make a good living doing that. And there's going to be some things technology can't fix. It can't put in a toilet for you and hot water pipes, stuff like that. I just think people are not gravitating towards trade work, and that's a mistake, right? And so you can see both in the healthcare and in the construction, it's not being averse to technology being integrated into work. It's looking for forms of work where the integration of technology is something where the control over the pace of change will be possible in a way that it wasn't for their fathers and grandfathers in the mills. And parents, without prompting, spoke specifically about that lesson, being part of how they had made decisions in their own work and how they were informing their children. And so you can see that there's an emphasis on sort of human skill, human judgment, and in integrating technologies in ways that will allow them to continue to do work that feels like it's the same, but can be augmented by tech instead of being replaced by it. And for a lot of parents, they felt like the push towards more and more technology in school was actually not great for kids like theirs, that pushing kids to learn more and more technology, we're losing old school tire changing skills. And we still don't have flying cars. We still need tires on them. We still have steel mills. We still need mechanics. We still need these skills. And again, this for me is why you have to understand how people are reacting to technological change in local space, because the notion that we still need people to work in mills, we still need mechanics, that's the mechanics part would be true everywhere. And we know that there are massive shortages of these kinds of skilled labor around the country. But the idea of we still have steel mills and we still need people in those steel mills is deeply local to places like Pittsburgh, and simply wouldn't resonate in a place like Southern California, where this is not part of the history. But you can see both a real emphasis on integrating technology into recognized forms of work, but also, you know, don't push our kids too far with technology, that these old school skills still really, really matter. And that sort of emphasis on trades and controlling the pace of change occurs alongside a very deep ambivalence about whether or not college is a good idea or whether it's worth it for their kids. And in some ways, that is a deeply blue collar sort of idea, because identifying as blue collar or working class is actually defined by not going to college. so it's not something that, unlike middle class college educated parents who are willing to put themselves into debt to give their kids a college education, these are parents who don't see that as a necessity because it hasn't been one necessarily for them. These are also parents whose moral framing around raising good kids has a whole lot to do with raising kids that are financially independent and can stand on their own feet. And so college debt has a specter of being a threat to constraining their children's future freedom, but also their own, because they don't want to create this financial interdependence that extends well into their children's adulthood in order to pay for college. So it's a relational risk and not just a financial one for these families. And as I said, the class identity is tied to not attending college. And many of these parents had received messages as they were growing up about who college was for and that it was not for kids like them. And so some of the sort of sub-themes and analytical codes in relation to this is that a lot of these parents had grown up in the generation that thought college was something everybody should do. College was the answer to every question, and they'd given it a try. And a lot of parents talked about having false starts where they'd done 6 months of this program and 2 years of that program, but they had never finished a degree. And so they were saddled with debt, but not a credential. They saw, for those who had gone to college, one of my most incredible interviews was with a mom who had got a degree in anthropology and was now working as an office manager and told me she doesn't know why she got a degree in anthropology because there's absolutely nothing she learned that she uses every day. And in the interview, proceeded to make at least 8 separate concrete references to how she does things and how she's preparing her own kids for high school that were absolutely related to the fact that she had done not just a college degree, but a degree in anthropology. But she couldn't see the connections because she's not working as an anthropologist. And so that is also very much tied to how higher education is framed for a lot of these families, that if you do a course in welding, you work as a welder. If you learn how to do, if you do a course in an electrician's course, you work as an electrician. You do a degree in anthropology and you don't work as an anthropologist, then what was the degree worth? Part of that is just sort of a mismatch in perception. For those parents who hadn't gone to college, everyone had a story of a close tie, a friend, a sister, an in-law who had spent a fortune on a college degree, wasn't working in that direct area, and was earning less money than they were. And so those were lessons they were passing down to their kids. And then there's, sort of, you balance that high risk sort of framing of college against forms of work that feel familiar, relatable, lower risk in the skilled trades. And you kind of have this balance between college looking a lot less attractive and skilled trades looking a lot more attractive to explain why parents were seeing things this way. But then there's the college trinity, which my own term. But I'd ask parents, well, are there any, things that your kids might want to do when they're older that you think would be worth going to college for? And they would say in the same order, if they want to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher, then it's worth going to college. Not to be an engineer, not to be a computer scientist, doctor, lawyer, teacher. Why? Because these are the college educated professions that blue collar parents know and understand what a day of work looks like. They have regular interactions with them. They know what teachers do. They know what doctors do. They have at least some idea of what a lawyer does. And so it's not opaque in the way that what does an engineer do feels completely opaque. They also understand why teaching, legal professions, and medical care would need to be regulated by state or federal entities. And so it feels reasonable to them that you would pay that money for that kind of job. And so part of, I think, the implication here for policy is about how you make other kinds of work that are college educated less opaque to families like these. The final step in flexible coding is attaching demographic descriptors so that you can see along your coding schemes whether there are significant differences in how mothers answered certain questions, or fathers, or African American parents, or white parents, or parents who do have a college degree or don't. And so what I found here is that the gender identity of their child is key to how parents see what work will look like for their kids. There's very gender dynamics in what the best forms of work are for their kids, with healthcare being something they see as for their girls and construction and skilled trades being for their boys. There's some blur in there, but it's generally pretty heavily gendered. The gender identity of parents I couldn't assess because of how overwhelming it was that mothers were the ones who signed up to be interviewed. So much so that when we called fathers, they would hand the phone to their wives and say, "My wife does things with kids." So those gender dynamics are very, very strong. What we didn't see in that demographic descriptor analysis is differences along parents' lines of education, whether or not they had a college degree, what their occupation was, reported household income, which varied enormously, or the racial identities of the parent or the child. And so what that suggests, these demographic descriptor analyses suggest, is that there really is something class-based going on here, that the other forms of difference that we see, aside from the gender dynamics of this, very little else sort of affects how people are making sense of this for their kids. There really is a working class assessment going on here. And that is sort of an excellent counterpart to the class-based sensibility that Caitlin Zaloom, who's a fantastic economic anthropologist, finds in her book, where she looks at middle-class families and the steps they take to pay for college at any cost, which is kind of like the counterpoint to working-class families standing at arm's length at looking at the same set of dynamics and saying, I don't think that's worth the cost. Middle-class families are paying it even if they have to remortgage their houses. Blue-collar parents are saying, we have other options. And so, I want to spend some more time on questions, but there's a few things here that I think, just in terms of our discussion are important. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the caring professions like healthcare provision, from nurse practitioners to occupational therapy to vet techs, and healthcare management are among the 20 jobs projected to grow the fastest over the next 20 years. The same is true for a number of jobs in construction and technical centers, including servicing green energy producers like wind turbines. So these families' assessments mirror what policymakers are predicting are industries for greatest growth. But of those jobs, there are only two, medical and health service managers and nurse practitioners, that have median pay of over $100,000 a year. So the societal and policy challenge we have here is how we make these areas of rapid economic growth into the kinds of good jobs that sustained families like these ones in Homestead for generations prior to this one. Jobs that pay well, that are accorded dignity, and that enable the kind of economic security and mobility that these young people's forebears worked hard in industry to ensure for their own families. Then I think this idea that we need more school systems in cities that put an emphasis on skilled trade training being viable options other than a college degree. There's a lot of reasons why this doesn't happen, not least of which is that K-12 expenditures are made through the US Department of Education, but vocational training and apprenticeship funding are the province of the Department of Labor. We have always separated these things. There may have been a time where that fundamental division made sense, but it definitely doesn't today. And having no options beyond college in many parts of the country hurts all young people in a rapidly changing, technologized future that's going to require thinking across traditional boundaries and creative new ways of building careers and expertise. So thank you all for giving me a chance to talk about this as I'm kind of building it out, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Vikki, thank you very much.